This graph shows the U.S. national debt from 1790 to the present. In 1835, during the presidency of the 7th President, Andrew Jackson, the national debt was almost paid off in full, falling to under $34,000. That was during the period when President Jackson was disestablishing the central bank of that time, the Second Bank of the United States, which was a forerunner of today's Federal Reserve. Note that the debt incurred during the war between the states, aka the Civil War, is barely noticeable. Then in 1913, a group of financiers and banking interests managed to get the Federal Reserve Act rammed through Congress, creating the Federal Reserve System. Note what happens to the national debt after the U.S. is saddled with this new and entirely unconstitutional central bank. The debt spiked up as a result of World War I, spiking less than an inch on this graph. Following the war, the debt was being paid down and decreasing. The New Deal during the Great Depression caused the debt to rise again, but what really set the debt upward was World War II, spiking several inches on the graph. And from there, it continued to grow and grow, often at an accelerated pace through the Korean War and the Vietnam War and the Great Society programs and the subsequent wars and new and expanded government programs. At the present time, the national debt stands at a little more than $16.5 trillion. The top of this graph over there represents $16.5 trillion. The length of this graph is 35 feet, and the debt is still growing. And just think, this entire pile of debt was all made possible by the Federal Reserve System. Without the central bank, the U.S. debt could never have reached these lofty heights. The Federal Reserve and its cronies in the U.S. government made all this possible. So how do we, the people, and our elected public servants deal with this monstrous and mushrooming national debt? It cannot continue to grow indefinitely because the interest on the debt would eventually crowd out all other government spending. And of course, long before that could happen, the entire debt-based system of finance would cease to function. So how do we deal with this national debt? Historically, as was done before the creation of the Federal Reserve and was done after World War I, much of the national debt was simply repaid. This was possible at that time because the U.S. was still functioning with a compromised, though more or less intact, constitutional monetary system based on gold and silver coin valued in the constitutional dollar. The dollar mentioned in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, and Amendment 7 of the U.S. Constitution is not a Federal Reserve note, because Federal Reserve notes did not even exist prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. No, what the U.S. Constitution was and is referring to is a silver coin patterned after the Spanish milled dollar of the late 1700s and containing at mintage 371¼ grains or 77.34375% of an ounce of pure silver. This Morgan silver dollar is an example of an actual constitutional dollar. This silver dollar is the constitutional unit of account of the United States. The so-called gold dollar was only statutory in nature, not constitutional. Furthermore, a so-called gold dollar is neither essential nor appropriate. Not essential because gold coinage can be denominated in something other than a dollar, such as the historical gold eagle or the contemporarily familiar gold ounce. And it is not appropriate because calling it a dollar can only lead to confusing it with the silver dollar, the nation's constitutional unit of account. At any rate, constitutional money and tender, that is, gold and silver coin, no longer circulate. The only instruments that circulate today in place of actual money are Federal Reserve notes and their auxiliary base metallic slug tokens. If then a Federal Reserve note is not a dollar, or even constitutional money or tender, what the heck is a Federal Reserve note? Constitutionally, a Federal Reserve note is a security, not money or tender. The Federal Reserve note originated as a promise to pay lawful money, that is, gold or silver coin valued in dollars. Although the Federal Reserve note's promise to pay now stands repudiated, it retains the form of a now repudiated promise to pay. Unlike constitutional gold and silver coin money, which was an evidence of wealth, the Federal Reserve note is an evidence of debt. Each and every Federal Reserve note has been borrowed into circulation. That is, the central bank's partners in crime holding positions in the U.S. government have delivered interest-bearing U.S. bonds to the central bank in exchange for the use of these fiat notes, or their digital electronic equivalents, created out of nothing by a quasi-public, though essentially private, central bank. U.S. taxpayers must pay interest on the bonds exchanged for each and every Federal Reserve note. It was hardly a coincidence that the 16th Amendment authorizing an income tax was purportedly ratified in 1913, the same year that the infamous Federal Reserve Act was enacted. At any rate, it should now be abundantly clear that today's national debt can never be paid off. This is not simply because of the enormity of the debt. Today's unconstitutional monetary system has ensured that the national debt will not be repaid. Today's monetary system was designed that way. It is impossible to repay the national debt because, as explained before, under the present system, only debt is being used as money. If there were no debt, there would be no money. It is all debt. It is also impossible to repay the national debt because under the present system, only the principal has been borrowed into circulation. In order to pay the interest on the debt, the interest must also be borrowed, and interest on the interest must be borrowed, and on and on and on. You see, the architects behind the Federal Reserve System and our nation's engineered national debt never intended for the debt to be repaid. After all, it cost them nothing. They created the debt and are still creating that debt out of nothing. They are really only interested in parasitically receiving the interest from the U.S. taxpayer in a never-ending stream. The whole purpose of the Federal Reserve and its engineered national debt has been and remains to keep we the people perpetually indebted and enslaved to the financiers and banking interests behind the scam, to enrich their tiny numbers at the expense of everyone else. The purpose was to rob what was once the wealthiest nation in the world. Now they want to get away with this biggest crime in history by erasing the last vestiges of our constitutional system of government and replacing it with their own totalitarian, corporativistic system of governance. I mentioned earlier that today's national debt can never be repaid. That being so, that leaves only two options for dealing with it: default or discharge. Default is a refusal to pay, a restructured default being a refusal to pay in full but making partial payment. Any default will tend to cause a rise in interest rates. A large enough default and large enough rise in interest rates would send our nation's economy into a deep depression, potentially far more devastating than the Great Depression of the 1930s. Discharging the debt with depreciating or worthless currency is the only other option in today's monetary system. Some of the debt has already been discharged in terms of purchasing power with depreciating currency through inflation. A terminal discharge of the debt will eliminate the national debt through hyperinflation. This will also eliminate the middle class and ultimately also send the nation into a deep depression. It was the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic during the 1920s and the accompanying social and political unrest and chaos that subsequently led to the rise of Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. So under the economic and monetary system now operating in the U.S., the only options for dealing with the national debt are default or discharge with fiat currency, or perhaps some of both. Either will be devastating to our country and to we the people. Note that these two options, default or discharge with fiat currency, are the only options under the present monetary system now operating in the U.S., and that with either option, the present system will essentially self-destruct. There is a way to minimize the painful consequences of the national debt by replacing the present system with the constitutional monetary system that operated in the U.S. in former times. There will be painful consequences whether the present system is replaced with the constitutional monetary system before the present system self-destructs or after the present system self-destructs. But the pain can be lessened by doing so before. Furthermore, if the present system is not replaced by the constitutional monetary system before the final collapse, there is a good chance that the resulting social and political unrest and chaos will usher in a totalitarian regime under the control of the very miscreants responsible for the creation of the Federal Reserve and the saddling of our nation with unprecedented amounts of debt. A totalitarian regime that will use every means at its disposal to crush any attempt at reasserting our constitutional system of government and guaranteed rights and its constitutional monetary system. Therefore, to minimize the painful consequences, I recommend that we the people make every effort to replace the present fiat funny money, fraudulent fractional reserve banking system with the constitutional sound money and accompanying honest banking system as soon as possible, and hopefully before the present system collapses. This brings us to the question, how do we replace the present corrupt system with the constitutional money and banking system? A first step to phasing out the Federal Reserve System and its pernicious fiat debt money would be to enact legislation similar to former Congressman Ron Paul's Free Competition and Currency Act of 2009, which would 1. Repeal or expunge the unconstitutional legal tender laws, and 2. Would prohibit taxation, including so-called capital gains tax or sales tax, on certain coins and bullion, including constitutional money and tender, i.e. gold and silver coin. And 3. would repeal certain other sections of the U.S. Code related to coinage.
The states respectively possess sufficient powers under Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, with respect to the prohibition against any state making anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, and under their essential sovereign functions under the 10th Amendment, and under their reserved powers of nullification and interposition to reintroduce constitutional money and tender, i.e. gold and silver coin, into their own financial transactions to shield their state and local governments and their populations from some of the chaos and disruptions from the collapse of the present economic system. But for whatever reasons, the states have been strangely and notoriously reluctant to assert these powers and to actually reintroduce constitutional gold and silver coin money and tender into their financial transactions. Passage of legislation similar to Ron Paul's Free Competition in Currency Act might help some or all of the states overcome their long-standing reticence and timidity in this matter.
Regardless of whether any of the states respectively take such initiative or not, ultimately the national legislators in La La Land on the Potomac need to take their oath of office seriously and enact a comprehensive monetary reform act and a comprehensive banking reform act to return the United States to a constitutional system of sound money and honest banking. I have here 2 pages of features of such a comprehensive monetary reform act and 2 pages of features of such a comprehensive banking reform act. Under these acts, the Federal Reserve would not be abolished all at once, but would be phased out over time. That is, it would be disestablished. Under these acts, financial transactions could be contracted in constitutional silver dollars or equivalent value in gold coin, but those financial transactions contracted in Federal Reserve note pseudo-dollars would remain payable or dischargeable in Federal Reserve note pseudo-dollars, unless renegotiated in constitutional silver dollars or equivalent value in gold coin. However, they would not be renegotiated Federal Reserve note pseudo-dollar for constitutional dollar at equal parity, but rather at the free market conversion rate between the two instruments, one constitutional dollar being far more valuable than one Federal Reserve note pseudo-dollar.
So here it is. This is how to minimize the painful consequences of the national debt. Return to the constitutional monetary system and a banking system compatible with it, in which government punishes abuses by the banking interests and does not partner with the banking interests in those abuses.
If you think of the failing economic system that exists in the U.S. today as a sinking ship, a sinking Titanic, you see the lamestream media and the typical politicians talking only about rearranging the deck chairs. Here, folks, here are the lifeboats you've been searching for. This way to the lifeboats. The lamestream media and the typical politicians may be content with going down with the sinking ship, but let them know loudly and clearly that we the people have other plans and are determined to save ourselves and our posterity from their failed and sinking system.